The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep. And he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading. And he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end, they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story: Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral example, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
If you're here for the first time, welcome. We're glad that you're here with us. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we also would like to welcome you. My name is Vasily. I'm one of the pastors here at Good News Church. You've seen the introduction to the book of Esther. As you know, if you've been attending for some time, that we're going through a 3.5 year series, which is the overview of all of the 66 books of the Bible, and we're doing it in a chronological manner. We're trying to see how it matches up to human history, but most importantly, we're trying to see it from the Christ-centered perspective. We want to see how it all points to Christ, even in the books of the Old Testament, the books of history, the books of poetry. And so this book, we will talk about it today, and we will talk about it the next Sunday. And today I just want to give you an introduction to this story with a couple of points that each of us can walk away from today. And so, as you've seen in the video, this book really stands out. And it stands out because God's name is never mentioned in the book. It reads as just history. It is read just as a regular story of what happened to some of God's people. In fact, there is no reference to prayer. There is reference to fasting, but there is no particular reference to prayer. There is no reference to the law or Torah or the commandments that the Hebrews received from God. There is none of that. There is no reference for the temple, in fact, which was kind of a big deal at that time. It was being rebuilt. So there are no miracles. There is no eye-opening experience of some sort. There is no parting of the sea. There is no burning bush. There is no giant that David has fought. Nothing like that is taking place in this book. There are no visions. There are no dreams that people have experienced as revelation from God. Esther is not quoted by any other author of the Bible. There is no reference to the book of Esther. There is no quotations or anything like that. In fact, that was one of the reasons that many people have argued that this book shouldn't even be part of the Bible, is that it's not really reference to anything else. In fact, there is no real deep theological content. It doesn't talk about deep theology in this book. And so at first glance, it seems like it's just a history lesson. It's just something that describes the history of the Jewish people in the area that they were exiled to. But in reality, it is much, much more than that. It is much more than just a history lesson. And when we really dig into this, we will actually see that God is very much present and that He is not absent when He is silent. And this book does, in fact, belong as part of the canon of the Bible. And so we see a story of God who is not expressly visible, who is not expressly manifest, but who is very much fulfilling His sovereign plan, who is very much working through Esther and Mordecai. And so there are a couple of lessons that I think we can walk away from the introduction to the story, from the beginning to this story, and we will conclude the following Sunday with the end of this story. And so before we get to those 2 points I want you to remember for today, let's talk a little bit about background. Let's find out what happened. I really like the video because it provided some of the background, but let me fill in the blanks for you. We've seen over the past several months, as we've been studying the Scripture together chronologically, we're seeing that God's people have been taken to exile by the Assyrians and by Babylonians, and they've been gone for a long time, and then eventually they're allowed to go back and rebuild their temple. And of course, they're running into difficulties. The Sumerians are trying to sabotage the whole thing, and the process gets drawn out to the next generation. It just gets very, very prolonged, very problematic. During this period, many of those people have walked away from God. They have broken God's commandments. They have broken God's instructions to those people. Many have questioned their faith. But also many have passed on their heritage. They've passed on their traditions. They've passed on the promises that God has given to those people. So some of the Jews are allowed to go back, rebuild the temple, and they got through that difficult process, through that difficult time. So when we're talking about Esther and Mordecai, we're not talking about the Jews that went back to rebuild the temple. We're talking about the Jews, the people that actually stayed in the area that they were originally exiled to. They were immigrants. There were people who were partially integrated, assimilated into the culture that they lived in. And unlike Daniel, who was very visibly Jewish, and he was insisting on, here's what I do 3 times a day. I go and I pray in my room towards Jerusalem. Unlike Daniel, this generation, you cannot tell very easily that they're Jewish. Why? They're living in a very hostile territory. They're living with the people that are pressuring them, where they're under the attack. And so it's easily possible to mistake them for locals. And it is something, you can mistake them for locals because they're hiding their cultural identity. They're hiding who they are. Because Persian culture is not very friendly to them. Now, I've mentioned Persia, and a few words about Persia so that you understand how big and powerful this empire is. So, this king, his name is Ahasuerus, and that's a Hebrew name. That's a Hebrew name. The Greek name of that is King Xerxes. And that name is pretty popular. It's been in the movies, it's been in video games, and everybody knows King Xerxes. And he's very famous, ruthless, violent, very unpredictable. And so he's ruling Persia, this empire that spreads 3 different continents. It spreads Europe, it covers Asia, and it also covers a chunk of Africa. So 3 continents. By some estimates, that empire consisted of 50 million people, which was about 44% of known population of the world at that time. Huge numbers, half of the world. Absolutely incredible. 2.9 million square miles. And Xerxes was famous for his parties. During one of those parties, as you've seen, he orders his queen to come and present herself so they can all look at her beauty, and she refuses. And so he gets rid of her and starts choosing a new wife. And then that is how Esther became the queen of Persia. Esther is an orphan. She's raised by Mordecai, who took her in as his own daughter, and she's been hiding her background. She's been hiding her culture. And yet now this Jewish young girl or young woman becomes a queen of Persia. And while she's queen, Xerxes promotes Haman above all the other servants, and this Haman guy is on a power trip. He wants everybody to worship him, right? So the only one who will not bow down before him, the only one who will not worship him is Mordecai. And so Haman gets really upset, and he finds out that the reason Mordecai will not bow down before him is because he's Jewish. He is filled with rage, and he decides to destroy all of the Jews because of Mordecai. And so he talks to Xerxes and he gets his blessing, and that's where we are at. Is we have Xerxes allowing Haman to destroy all of the Jewish people in Persia. Take a look at Esther chapter 3 verse 13. Xerxes signs an edict or a law, and it says in Esther 3:13, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, the whole Persia, with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. That's a pretty bad deal. All of the Jews in Persia were to be killed. Men, women, children, whether you're young or old, doesn't matter. And all of their possessions were allowed to be taken. All of their possessions are up for grabs. In one day. That's a bad deal. And so Mordecai learns what happens. And then he's mourning. In fact, all of the Jews throughout all of Persia, they're mourning, they're crying out, they're weeping, they're anticipating this horrible fate that is before them. In all of the provinces, in all of the cities, in all of the villages, it's a pretty public public thing, pretty big deal. And so this is what's leading up to the passage that I want us to take a look at today as an introduction to the book of Esther. Open with me your Bibles on the book of Esther chapter 4, and we'll read verses 8 through 14. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai has said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them in reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. When we look at the book of Esther, we see God who is very much at work. Even though there is no eye-popping miracles, even though there are no visions, there is nothing really incredible going on, what we do see is we see that God's plan is just penetrating the lives of these people, regular people, messed up people, people who are not even morally very good people. But God is using them, broken people like you and I, to fulfill His plan and fulfill His promises. What we're seeing is that Esther and Mordecai did not get their positions of power, they did not get their positions of influence on accident. What we're seeing is God placing them there, God kind of orchestrating the whole thing in putting them into one place where eventually they'll have to make a decision. Eventually they'll have to decide what to do next. He had a purpose for them. And Esther had a choice to make. She had a very real decision that had very real consequences to make. And that decision was simple. It was difficult to do, but the core essence of it was very simple. Whether or not to be faithful to God and to her people. Whether or not to be obedient. It was her defining moment. It was the very time when what she did would either lead her down on one path or the other. Now, how many of you have experienced those defining moments where the decision that you make will lead you down to two very, very different paths? Esther's decision had tremendous consequences, and she was in a unique position to make a big difference in the lives of her people. And she didn't fail that test. She actually was used by God to benefit her people in an incredible way. So I don't know about you, but I picture Esther as having doubts. When I look at Esther, what I'm picturing is a young woman who is really scared, whose life, most of her life, was absolutely outside of her control. In fact, her marriage wasn't the one that she picked. Her family wasn't the one that she picked. She was an orphan, living in a culture that was not friendly to the Jews. In fact, she had to hide her identity. She was under the authority of others. I see her feeling insignificant. I see her feeling unimportant, inconsequential. Have you ever felt that in your life? Have you ever experienced that thought where, you know what, it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter because, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to affect anything. Have you ever wondered about what difference you can make in your life? Esther couldn't possibly imagine that God was orchestrating her circumstances in order to put her in a position where her decision will have a big, big impact. And it doesn't mean that God was just, pulling the strings and that she didn't have a choice in the matter. No, she was not a robot. She had a very important decision to make, a personal decision, a real decision with real consequences. And that decision was hers alone. Like you and I have to make decisions all the time. And some of those decisions have very real consequences that will last all of our lifetimes. And so the first lesson that we can take away from this story is this: we must recognize the role that we play in God's plan. We must recognize, we must understand what your position is, what your role is in God's sovereign plan. I must understand what my responsibility, what my role is in God's plan for my life. Because He's going to do incredible things. He's going to do incredible things next year. He's going to do awesome things around us 1 month from now. He's going to do amazing things next week. He's going to do incredible things around you today. And so the question is, are you going to be obedient and faithful to what He's calling you to do and who He's calling you to be in order to be part of that? What decision will you make? Because just like Esther, you have a choice. In your family, at your work, at your school, with your neighbors, will you be faithful and obedient? Will you take that defining moment and will you use it for His glory? Or will you be scared and just run away from God's face? Well, guess what? God is still going to accomplish everything that He intends to accomplish, whether or not you agree to it. He just won't use you. His plan, His sovereign plan, His incredible plan of salvation of humanity is still going to happen because He is in control of it all. But you'll give up an opportunity to be part of the incredible things that God is doing around you every day. Esther had a choice. And you and I have a choice. And what's incredible is in verse 14, Mordecai reminds Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such time as this. You have to recognize what role you're playing in God's sovereign plan, because God works through your choices and my choices every day. He works out that plan through my choices. And let's not miss an opportunity to be part of that plan and be part of the incredible things that He is doing in our lives today. And so Esther had a choice. And she sends her reply to Mordecai. And she knows that her decision has very real consequences. But here's what she says in verses 15 through 17. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Think about it. Esther had every reason to believe that God has abandoned her. A young immigrant girl in a culture that is very hostile, who is an orphan, whose life is completely not under her control. She's occupying a position where the previous queen was just deposed of. And yet, she takes a risk. She risks everything she has to be obedient and faithful to God by being obedient and faithful to her people. She risks her life for the people. She knows that if she approaches the king, which is against the law, without being invited to, there is a very real chance that she is going to lose absolutely everything she's got. You and I often make choices like that. If you and I make a decision and a promise to God to be obedient and faithful to Him, you and I must absolutely understand there will come a time when we will have to risk things that are important to us. And we will have a real choice to make, whether you're going to be obedient and faithful and risk it all, or you're going to run away and try to save what you think is important to you. There is a very real opportunity. There is a very real possibility that that is going to happen. And the Bible talks about that. I know we all like to think of David and Goliath, where, as long as we believe, we'll come out, we'll beat that giant. And as long as I do this, God's going to empower me. But you know what? Look at Stephen, stoned to death. And when I say stoned to death, I don't mean the current culture's definition. I mean put to death with stones. Prophets some were ignored, some were killed. Disciples imprisoned, persecuted, killed. Jesus was crucified. A shameful death of a criminal. Maybe, like Esther, you've had some painful things happen in your life. Maybe, like Esther, it didn't look like God was very close to you. Maybe it looked like God abandoned you at that time. But He has a way. He has a way of taking those pains, those hurts, those circumstances, whatever it is happening in your life, and redeeming it. Your character, your experiences, your gifts, your abilities, your hope, your faith, all of those things, and redeeming those things for Him. Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the dead so that God could bring screwed up people like Mordecai and Esther into His kingdom. Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the dead so that screwed up people like you and I can come in to the kingdom. And that birth again, that new nature in us, it calls us to be obedient and to be faithful. And now these broken and sinful and screwed up people like you and I can be used for His glory. Just like Esther was used for His glory. And you got to remember that there is nothing, absolutely nothing in your family history. There is nothing in your criminal history. There is nothing in the history of your dumb decisions of the past. There is nothing like that that is outside of the sovereign power of God. That is outside of what Jesus has covered by His death on the cross. God can do absolutely anything and everything without you. He can. He's God. He can do anything. But He chooses not to. Because by being faithful and obedient to God, you're fulfilling your purpose. Take a look at Ephesians 2:10. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for what? For good works, which God has prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. One of the purposes that God has created you and I before we even existed, before we were born, is He has prepared a job for you and I to do. Not because God couldn't do it without us, but because that fulfills the purpose of yours and my existence. And if we run away and if we're not taking the risk associated with that decision, if we're not taking the risk associated with that obedience and that faithfulness, then we're not fulfilling our purpose. You and I have a purpose for which God has created us. And next time you come to a pivotal moment in your life, to an important point in your life where you have to make a decision that will lead you down two paths, I would like you to remember this verse. Ask yourself a question. Maybe the reason you are existing, the reason God has placed you in those circumstances, is to exist for times or such time as this. Just like Mordecai asked Esther. Who knows, verse 14, whether you have not come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Consider your circumstances. Consider your situation. Consider what God has put you in this moment in your life. And maybe you got to answer a very real question. Maybe you got to answer the question of, maybe I'm supposed to be here for such a time as this. Maybe one of the reasons God has led me through all those pain and suffering and different circumstances and stupid decisions, and He has allowed those things to happen for this time right here. And then, if like Esther, you're willing to take a risk and commit to being obedient and faithful to God, then you will be used for His glory. So, two things that I want you to remember out of this passage is that the first thing, we have to understand and recognize what our role is in God's sovereign plan. And that role is simply obedience. Being willing to do what God wants us to do. And then the second piece is that every decision that we have carries a certain risk that we have to be willing to accept. If your decisions for Jesus, if your decisions for God have no risk associated with it, then maybe we're not doing what He expects us to do. And so I would encourage each of us, as we go on our daily lives, as we come to certain forks in our roads, as we come to certain forks in our paths, to ask ourselves a question: has God led me to this very point in my life for such a time as this? Amen? Let us stand and pray.